paper examines the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on global supply chains from a modern slavery perspective. It particularly focuses on how modern slavery has impacted the ability of companies to conduct their social audits and also their ability to reach workers within their supply chains. We also considered the use of technology to overcome the disruption that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, with a focus on a prize audit, a piece of worker interview technology developed by the Mekong Club and United Nations University Institute in Macau. This paper includes interviews and testimonials from a number of different global companies, as well as extracts from data sets taken from the Prize Audit platform. There were a number of key findings that we found through this project. The first being that most companies found that COVID-19 negatively impacted their ability to conduct social audits effectively. The most prevalent challenge identified by these companies was the inability to travel, so physically being unable to visit the factories in their supply chains. We found that most companies did incorporate some degree of so-called remote auditing to overcome these challenges, but this approach had a mixed degree of success, with some technical issues and lack of trust, leading to many of the companies that we spoke to questioning the long-term viability of this particular practice. We found that the companies that we spoke to were generally quite keen to incorporate new technology into their auditing processes, but wished to do so without creating an over-reliance on that new technology. Within this paper, we took a sample data set of thousands of interviews of workers conducted before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of that data set, we found that 29% of the interviews of the factory workers raised at least one indicator of forced labor risk, as mapped to the ILO indicators of forced labor. We found that the average number of indicators raised per interview where risk was identified was 2.5. So therefore, if a worker typically has been found to be at risk, they typically display more than one ILO indicator of forced labor at any given time. So I'll go into more detail on each of these points through this presentation today. The COVID-19 pandemic had undeniable impacts on many different industries across the world. But to really understand how COVID-19 impacted the ability of companies to conduct their social compliance programs and to fight modern slavery in their supply chain, we decided to interview 12 companies across different industries in order to understand how COVID-19 actually impacted their social auditing processes in both the short and longer terms, as well as understanding how technology played a role in their response to these challenges that were posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We interviewed companies across multiple industries, including supermarket retail, medical supplies, healthcare, clothing manufacture and retail, toy manufacturing, and health and beauty. The people interviewed spanned many different roles, including human resource managers, corporate responsibility managers, those working in sustainability and quality control, as well as senior directors of responsible sourcing and heads of ESG. Through these interviews, we identified a number of key challenges that were common across the board for companies looking to continue their social auditing program through the pandemic. Travel restrictions were the most frequently cited challenge. The inability to physically travel to reach factories and production facilities as a result of these restrictions and related quarantine requirements meant that most companies found that in-person audits became completely impossible to conduct in certain jurisdictions. Those who were able to conduct some level of the in-person auditing reported continual challenges. So even if they were able to send either a staff member or a third-party support with representation in that country to conduct those in-person sessions, They reported that the burden and the cost required to send somebody to conduct these audits through the pandemic meant that they had to significantly reduce the number of audits that they were conducting. It was also reported through these interviews that unannounced audits became much less frequent across the board in many locations, as suppliers or factories were denying auditors access to the factories without a prior warning due to restrictions on movement and restrictions on factory access as a result of COVID-19. The specific countries that were highlighted by those companies surveyed spanned the entirety of Asia Pacific. With regards to China, some companies, especially those with extensive supply chains across China, reported that through a large part of the pandemic, they were still able to conduct in-person social audits, as they already had staff on the ground in China who were able to travel. However, this situation has been changeable. And as with many other countries across Asia, it wasn't always the case. So this added uncertainty in terms of the conditions, in terms of the ability to access, created even more challenges, especially for those organizations that needed to really forward plan their audit programs and have some degree of certainty in terms of which countries they will be able to access at any given time. So incorporating some degree of remote auditing was certainly identified as key to continuing social audits, despite the challenges that were identified. So typically amongst those companies that we interviewed, this involved utilizing video technology, perhaps having virtual video enabled walkthroughs of a factory or a site, where auditors would sit on a screen and ask to view particular areas and check for certain health and safety measures. In some cases, companies reported that they tried to interview workers over video call as well as part of that remote auditing process. Where possible, companies indicated that they did have a preference to have at least one person, either company representative or maybe a third-party partner or NGO partner present at the factory during that remote audit. However, due to these COVID-19 restrictions, in many cases, this was not possible. So companies were really required to rely on the information that they could gather remotely. There are a number of different technologies that were identified by the companies that were used more frequently during this process. So video conferencing technologies such as Teams or Zoom were used for those remote walkthroughs. Messaging platforms such as WeChat or WhatsApp and email were used for communication with the factory management, as well as video calls on smartphones. And of course, we will talk a little bit about the Apprise audit platform, which many of the companies interviewed incorporated into their remote auditing practices in order to interview workers. So there are a number of limitations recorded with these remote auditing approaches. Many reported that they were really kind of learning how to implement this new way of working under really substantial pressure. A spotlight was really being shone on the plight of migrant workers in supply chains at a time where access to those very workers was very, very limited. So companies were experiencing a lot of pressure to be reaching these workers and having to quite quickly implement completely new processes and completely new solutions, something that they'd never done before. So many responded to kind of indicate that this was really a learning experience, and a number of challenges were reported along the way. One technical challenge being, of course, that in many remote locations, many factory locations, the Wi-Fi would be unstable, and there may be limited access to more advanced technologies, smartphones with video, for example, and good internet connection. So this meant that these remote audits could become very time-consuming. There could be missed information, miscommunication, and it could literally be impossible to really clearly see the conditions of the factory due to these technical limitations. Another commonly reported challenge was around the superficial nature of these audits. If the factory is in control of the walkthrough, if there's not a person on the ground there, They have complete control over what the auditor sees on their computer screen. Auditors felt they were unable to really speak with workers directly and conduct those interviews, which made for a challenge, and a number of companies saying that while they appreciated the ability to conduct remote audits, they would always appreciate that there was a real limitation in terms of how much they could really trust how valid those audits were and how thorough the information within them was.
This video was made possible through support provided by US Agency for International Development and produced by the Mekong Club and Winrock International. The opinions expressed herein are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the US Agency for International Development.